How's it going, everyone? Feeper here with another video for you. So I noticed something after doing my PvE and some of my PvP tank guides now that I kind of wanted to talk about, and I'm calling it sort of, balance versus identity. It's the lack of diversity that the way the tanks mitigate damage in 14, and I guess sort of like identity that the classes have, at least on the defensive side. The way that the 4 tanks in 14 mitigate damage is very, very similar. So I kind of want this video to be like an analysis of the way these 4 jobs mitigate damage, and to a lesser extent the game as a whole. I'm going to make some comparisons to other MMOs, namely WoW Classic, just because it's like the most recent thing in my memory. But this isn't supposed to be like a what's better, Classic or 14 video, like who cares. They're 2 different games. It's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. I just want to like use it to illustrate a point. So while it might sound like I'm complaining about 14, which I mean I guess I am, it comes from a place of like wanting to keep the game fresh and keep it interesting and not let it stagnate. Like I really enjoy 14. I don't want it to just kind of like fall off. Not that I think it is or anything. Obviously it's just getting more and more popular with every expansion, but there is a trend I'm noticing of them trying to make everything more and more accessible for new players, and thus I think they're kind of lowering the skill ceiling. Maybe not so much the skill ceiling, but like, yeah, they're not lowering the skill ceiling. They're lowering the class identity. Like every expansion, the classes feel more and more homogenous. I'll kind of explain what it means. So let's get started. Now again, I'm not going to sit here and try and tell you that offensively the tanks are the same. Paladin is about flowing between these 2 buff states. Gunbreaker has this big burst every 60 seconds and a smaller one every 30. Warrior and Dark Knight sort of, they share a common thread with Inner Release and Delirium basically being the same thing, but Dark Knight sort of separates itself with weaving in Edge of Shadows and having to manage mana that Warrior doesn't even have to think about. So obviously, offensively the tanks are different. Like that's a given. Where I run into an issue is how they mitigate damage. So part of this is, I guess, maybe a little bit due to the role actions, but I don't really think that that's at the core of the issue. The stuff that I'm talking about is more like every tank has an oh shit button. Every tank has Sentinel. They're just different animations and they have a different name. They each have like an AoE either shield thing with like Divine Veil Shake It Off, or they have, Dark, Heart of Light and Dark Missionary are literally the exact same ability, and it's just so stupid. Not only do I think it's boring that all the tanks are just so similar like this, I just think it makes them feel too similar. At the end of the day, does Gunbreaker really go about mitigating damage any different than Paladin? When the Tank Buster comes up, when Rip Current's coming up in Leviathan and it's about to splash you real hard, like if you're a Paladin or a Gunbreaker, are you really going to do anything different? Like, does it really matter? No, it's the same. You're just going to either eat it with your invuln, or you're just going to pop Nebula Sentinel, same thing, and just move on with your life and continue your DPS rotation. The biggest, like the most unique parts of the defensive kits come in with like the single target buffs that each of them have, like Intervention, Hearthstone, obviously the Blackest Night, because that ability is just amazing and just super cool, and then Nascent Flash. Intervention and Nascent Flash, well, they're all different though, because like Nascent Flash gives you both healing. Intervention, you can have a lot of mitigation depending on if you have Rampart and Sentinel up at the same time. The Blackest Night is then turned into an offensive ability if the bubble pops, and then Hearthstone has a second effect if you have Brutal Shell on. So like they all have a thing that they do that separates them a bit, which I think is cool. They'll have like different cooldowns where they cost gauge or mana or something. So like, that's all fun and all, well and good. But imagine if every single thing that the tanks did was different like this. Like take Warrior, okay? So it used to be that Warrior was like the HP sponge tank. Obviously you have Thrill of Battle and you have Equilibrium. But what if we went further with that? So what if, say Warrior, you can keep Home Gang, sure, because why not? But say you didn't have, I guess you would have Rampart because it's a role action, but say you don't have Rampart and say you don't have Vengeance. The only defensive cooldowns you have are Nascent Flash and Raw Intuition. Then you have Equilibrium and Thrill of Battle, and then maybe like one more, I guess you could have like another temporary tank, temporary like health boost or something, or I don't know. But what if you had like a passive you get at 80 that every single time you use Inner Chaos, you increase your maximum health by like I don't know, 5% or something. And you can stack that up to like 15 times or whatever. Like, obviously the numbers would have to be fine-tuned. But like, imagine that using your kit offensively, because that's the other thing as a warrior is like, you would use offensive abilities to be defensive. You know, you would use Inner Beast to deal damage, and then for the next 5 seconds or whatever it was, you take less damage. You would eat a tank buster by doing damage. Like, that's really cool. So what if every time you did Inner Chaos, you gained more and more health, and if you die, you lose the stacks. But like, so as the fight goes on, you're like slowly getting more and more powerful and harder and harder and harder to kill. You know, which is kind of like what a warrior does. Like, warriors are supposed to be the people that keep on fighting when everyone else is like, oh, I'm out of mana, I can't do anything. Like, you know what I mean? They're supposed to be like, lol XD rar, and just like keep killing things. So like, imagine if that's what warrior was like, and it's the way it mitigated damage was like, yeah, it has raw intuition, but then like the rest of it is you just eat the damage and you just have so much health that it doesn't matter. That would make it so much more different, or that much more different, I should say, than Paladin. And maybe Paladin can just be kind of like your straight up like, I'm just going to mitigate this damage because I have a shield and all these defensive options. And then take Gunbreaker. You know, what if Gunbreaker didn't have a single defensive cooldown except for like maybe Super? And then, you know, hopefully Super's more, in this alternate timeline, maybe Super's more exciting than Hollow Ground, but you kill yourself in the process. So imagine if Gunbreaker has no defensive cooldowns, and the way that it mitigates damage is it has a bunch of abilities that just reduce the boss's damage output. You know, so like if you're the main tank as a Gunbreaker, and you know they're gonna Stone Crusher you, you know, what if you have an ability that reduces the boss's damage dealt by like 40% for 5 seconds? And that's how you mitigate damage. But you yourself don't have any actual cooldown, or maybe you have like Heart of Stone, and that's it. You know what I mean? Like maybe Heart of Stone, Heart of Light, that's all you have. And then so you don't have not anticipation, not awareness. Oh, what's it called? Oh my god, whatever the parry one is. Camouflage, that's what it is. And you don't have Nebula, you don't have Rampart. So you said Heart of Stone, Heart of Light, and then like, I don't know, Super. And then the rest of it, you have like 2 damage mitigation things, or maybe you don't have Heart of Light and Heart of Stone, you just have like 3 damage mitigation things. Or like that'd be cool. Like that would be interesting. That would be, then that tank would be different. It would be fundamentally different from the rest of them. And then I don't know, Dark Knight could be, maybe Dark Knight is just like kind of like how what Scholar sort of used to be, and it still is, but more so used to be. Scholar was, I am going to just flat out make people not take damage instead of healing them. And White Mage is like, I will just heal people. They play completely differently because one is about preventing damage while the other is about just outright healing it. What if Gunbreaker was about preventing damage, Paladin was about just straight mitigating it, Dark Knight was about just, I guess, preventing damage as well with like shields or something. I don't know. You could play off the Blackest Night thing a bit more with Dark Knight, sure. And then Warrior was about just taking the hit, but you have so much health that it doesn't matter. Like, just thinking about that, it just makes me so excited. Like, that would be so cool. So this observation sort of came to light through playing a bunch of PvP and to a lesser extent WoW Classic. I'll start with PvP. So in PvP, the 4 tanks feel, at least to me, a lot more unique, and you get much more of the class fantasy and the class identity with those than you do in PvE, because I mean, part of it's because you have less abilities, so you have more limitations, which I think is probably the most important word in this discussion is limitations. You have more limitations in PvP, so when you go in as a paladin, you know, you are about CC and just mitigating people's damage, and then like not having to have the healer heal you because you heal yourself. Like, that's what you do as a paladin. You know what I mean? Is you stun the shit out of people, you heal yourself, so the healer doesn't have to think about you. Kind of. And I mean, you have cover as well. And then you confetti everyone because you're a pinata, you know, and you make them do less damage. Warrior is about just home-ganging one person and you just freaking fell cleave their face into oblivion, you know? like that's what you do as a warrior, is you just do a bunch of damage. I mean, yeah, you have like CC, but it's not nearly as much as the other tanks. You know, Gunbreaker has a lot of burst, and a lot of healing, and it has like AoE CC, but it's not like readily available all the time. and it's not super long-lasting CC. So yes, you can hit a lot of people with it, but it's not something that you can use the second you need it. You know, you have to have a cartridge and you have to have draw power up. And then like Dark Knight is all about making the enemy take more damage and reducing their healing. Like that's how it helps its team, is it makes it so that the enemy can't heal as much, they take more damage, and then you can chain these stuns and chain your blood gauge and stuff like that. And then you have the Blackest Night as well. So like they each play differently. You know, I don't play Paladin the same way as I play Dark Knight. Dark Knight, I'm a little bit more aggressive, and I'm trying to set up kills more by making them take more damage and reducing their healing, whereas Paladin, I play a bit more defensively, and I'm just trying to like straight up mitigate damage and then just help CC people when the DPS mark targets. And then Warrior, you're like super aggressive, and honestly, sometimes you just stick on the healer and you just spam everything on them so they have to heal themselves and they can't heal anyone else, and you just like literally AFK, forget about your team. You just kill the healer. I mean, don't actually do that, but it kind of works, which is kind of weird. And the Gunbreaker, I don't know, you just do whatever you want, really. It's Gunbreaker, it's so OP right now, you can just kill everything. But going off that, you know, let's take a look at Classic. Again, I don't want this to be like a 14 versus Classic video per se, because again, it's apples and oranges. They're two very different games and very different time periods, so let's not get too deep into it. But there is a substantial difference to playing, you know, if you roll Shaman as opposed to rolling a Mage, your experience will be very different playing the game. And it's not just because of like the spells that you have and stuff like that. You know, Mages can teleport people to cities. They can conjure their own food and water, so they save a lot of money and time on that. They have Blink to get around the map easier. They have a lot of slows and binds and things for PvP and for AoE grinding mobs. So they have a bunch of that stuff that like Shaman can't really AoE grind that well, but it has a lot of utility with the fact that you can heal or DPS in a dungeon, and honestly, you can kind of tank as well. And then you provide a lot of buffs that aren't just straight damage. You know, you can cleanse poisons, you can heal, replenish mana, give armor. Like, there's a lot of things you can do as a shaman for your team, or your party. And then at 20, you get Ghost Wolf, which is basically just a free mount, which just makes the leveling process way easier. And then you have, you know, you have interrupts and dots and things. So, like, those two classes feel different in more ways than just, oh, I'm casting Fireball as a Pyro Mage, and I'm smacking things with my Rock Enhanced two-hander as an Enhancement Shaman. Like, it's more than just that. The classes all have limitations to them, and there's things that they excel at and things that they don't excel at that makes it feel like you're actually playing something different. Whereas, like, you know, playing Gunbreaker and Paladin, obviously the offensive rotation is very different, but defensively, I mean, they're basically the same thing. I don't really feel that different playing a Gunbreaker and mitigating than I do a Paladin. I feel different when I'm in my Gnashing Fang combo as opposed to just like Atonement Span, or, you know, for 3 GCDs or whatever it is, but defensively, I feel like they're pretty much the same thing. Again, it's because of the limitations placed on the classes and the necessity for you to have to do things with other people to fill in the gaps that you have that makes everything feel unique. You know, these games are supposed to be RPGs at the core, right? It's an MMO RPG, which I think modern MMOs have sort of lost the RPG element a bit. You know, there's a reason why you have to party up with people to do things. It's to cover your weaknesses. Now, this discussion starts to get kind of tricky when you bring in the topic of balance. You know, I think it sucks that the tanks are pretty homogenous at this point, but I also think it would suck to say if you love Dark Knight and like that's what you want to do is play Dark Knight and you want to raid as Dark Knight, but for whatever reason, Dark Knight is underpowered and is seen as not being able to do the content, or it's a lot harder to do so much harder to do the content that people don't want to bring it to a raid, that you can't get a spot and do any of these raids because no one wants to play with you because you're a Dark Knight. Like, that would also suck, because then you can't play the game and you can't play what you want because it's not balanced. You know, so that's one example of why, I guess, sort of what I'm suggesting could be bad. Or take my Gunbreaker example, where it doesn't actually have any defensive cooldowns, it just mitigates damage by making the enemies do less. You know, maybe that would really suck in dungeons. You know, especially if you don't have like an AoE damage reduction thing, like maybe that would really suck in dungeons and make that content really hard, and like you wouldn't really have fun doing experts because you can't survive anything and you can't do big pulls and people are like, what's going on? You know, or a tank that just eats damage by having a bunch of health. You know, maybe it would be so OP that like everything else just isn't viable. You know, that was also a problem. Like, you know, Warrior was so good in Heaven's War and Stormblood that you pretty much always brought one if you were trying to like optimize and things because it was just so strong. Of course, if you don't care about optimizing like that, you just want to play what you find is fun, which I think at the end of the day is what you should do, then I guess it doesn't really matter. But, you know, there's always going to be people out there who are playing in a more casual environment, but they're trying to play it like they're at the very tippy top of rating, and they're going to get mad at you if you don't bring the most optimal comp or whatever. You know, I think it's fun to optimize and do the best that you can, and if you know, are in like world first prog groups for Ultimate and stuff, yeah, there's going to be 8 jobs that you're going to want to bring, and you're not going to want to bring anything else, because those are going to be the best for progging. And then once you prog and you do the fight, then maybe those change. You know, maybe say, like I've heard Dark Knight Paladin is pretty good for prog, which makes sense. But then once you prog and you get the fight down, then maybe you want to switch out one of those for Gunbreaker because it does a bunch more damage, and it'll be easier to hit the enrage checks. So I would personally rather not sacrifice class identity for the sake of balance, but that's also just my opinion, and not everyone's going to agree with that. Everyone has different takes on the game and what they want from the game, and I could see, you know, someone who, I don't want to use the word casual because I think that has an extra connotation to it that is negative, but, you know, someone who wants to enjoy the Savage content but doesn't have the time to put a bunch of hours into a static or something. You know, maybe they just want to jump in and play their favorite job, and if that job is so poorly weak, or so weak that they can't clear the content easily, they're not going to want to play the game, and that's not going to be fun for them, which sucks. And I agree, like I wouldn't want that for anyone. So it's kind of a weird fine line to walk between keeping things unique and keeping them interesting, while also not having them be so blatantly overpowered or blatantly underpowered that you can't play whatever you want all the time, especially with a game like 14 where you can play everything on one character. Another thing that sort of feeds my opinion on this is how the jobs are designed, and more so how the fights are designed. You know, so I kind of took a look at the jobs more under a microscope, like just tanking, but now I kind of want to look at the game and how it's designed as a whole. And the biggest thing I want to talk about is DPS. DPS and like how strict the mechanics are. So in 14, you know, I personally think that 14 has the best designed, at least from a mechanic standpoint, the best designed raid fights, because I mean, look at something like Titan. There's so many things that you have to execute right, and like the mechanic dance is so fun in these fights, and they do such a good job with it, making everything very clear, or if it's not immediately clear, or you're dying into it once or twice and you're like, okay, boom, got it. You know, it's really, really, really well done, and everything just looks beautiful, and there's all these crazy effects, and like the art team is killing it. Like everyone's killing it, right? But when you dive deeper, you sort of start to see some of the flaws in their design, or not so many, maybe flaws isn't the right word, but I think they've kind of pigeonholed themselves into a very niche combat loop, I guess, is the best way to describe it. So obviously in any MMO, people who are doing more damage per second than others are going to be seen as better. But I think that problem is exacerbated more in 14 because the fights are so strict. They're so strict, and like the time, like once you pull the boss, you have X amount of time. Ooh, I smacked my desk. You have X amount of time to kill the boss. You know, there's no like, okay, once you get the boss to 20%, then you have blank time to kill it before it enrages. It's like, no, you pull the boss, and then you have 13 minutes, or whatever the case may be, to kill the boss, and that's it. Like, period, done, end story, right? So I think that kind of plays into, you know, the reason why tanks kind of just feel like DPS that are beefier and like pop cooldowns. Like, I'm not gonna lie, That's pretty much what tanks are in this game, because you don't have to manage threat, because they made that literally you press a button and your problem is solved, which I disagree with. I think they should not have. I think for new players it's nice, and I kind of miss the dancing thing, but I also do think it's good because now like anyone can pull instead of like just warrior because they lose the least. But at the same time, it was, at least there was like a little bit of a threat of losing aggro before, and now it's just you press this button and your aggro generation. I mean, I can go from 8th aggro and then press Defiance, and like 3 GCDs later, I'm 2nd, and I think that's stupid. Again, I hate to compare it to WoW Classic because they're so different, but you know, in Classic, like generating threat, like no one care. I mean, obviously, the more damage you can do as a tank while keeping threat, the better you are. But like at the end of the day, no one really gives two flying poops about how much damage you're doing. What they care about is how much threat per second you're generating. And in 14, threat per second isn't even something that anyone like remotely thinks about, because it's all about your DPS, because threat generation is just so easy. While I do think it's fun to be able to sort of focus on your DPS and optimize that as a tank, I do think it leaves a bit to be desired, because again, you kind of just end up feeling like a DPS that has cooldowns. You know, defensive cooldowns that make you take those damage, you can take the tank busters, whatever. Before you had your enmity generating combos, which was cool, like that was a way to sort of combat the threat issue, but not that it was really that much of an issue, honestly, to begin with, because unless they put Shirk in the game, it was very easy. No one really used those, or people tried to use those as little as possible anyways, because it makes you take less damage, or it makes you do less damage, and damage is the most important thing in the game. You know, look at healers. The way you optimize being a healer, which I actually did raid a little bit as a healer, and I immediately dropped it because I was like, I hate this, because I went into healing with the mindset of I'm going to heal. And I very quickly realized that the way you become a good healer is by healing as little as possible. Which for some people, that's a lot of fun. And like, if that's fun for you, you know, great. Like, that's awesome. But if I'm going to play a healer, I want to heal people. If I'm on a DPS, I'll play a DPS. You know, if I'm playing a tank, I want to like generate threat, mitigate damage for myself and my party. That's what I want to do as a tank. I don't want to necessarily just pop cooldowns when I need to and just basically be a DPS that does less damage, you know? So one of the reasons why I think they have such a hard time, I mean not hard time, but one of the reasons why they're reluctant to add new ways for tanks to mitigate damage and stuff, you know, with like look again with Gunbreaker, they didn't add anything new in terms of mitigation. It's just old things with new names. I think one of the reasons why they're hesitant to add things like that is because since the timeline is so strict for all these fights, if you have new abilities and new, especially ones that have, you know, new mechanics, they have to fit into this like time block that works. You know, if you have, you know, I mean, look at Earth and Fury in Titan. Earth and Fury, once he goes big boy, boom, spoiler alert. Once he goes big boy, he does Earth and Fury, you reprisal, which apparently it doesn't work, but apparently it does, but apparently I've heard it doesn't work, I've heard it does work, I've heard it only works on the dot, and I've heard it only works on the main damage, not the dot, so who the hell knows, but assuming it works. So Earth and Fury happens, and you reprisal, right? Then the next Earth and Fury happens exactly a minute after, or maybe not exactly, but so close to a minute after that your reprisal pretty much just comes up cooldown and you can use it again. You know, that's an example of the fights being on this strict timeline and this strict time block, and you having a way to mitigate it that has to also be on that strict time block. Otherwise, people are going to lose their shit and go crazy. You know, how things line up in this game is very, very crucial to, I mean, our Black Mage is thinking about switching from Black Mage after having played it for so long because it doesn't line up well with Titan and he's not enjoying it, which is understandable. But because these things are so strict, it's hard to introduce new ideas and new concepts for new jobs and new boss mechanics because everything has to be so laid out and predictable. Otherwise, the community will just not enjoy it because of the way that the game has been structured since Realm Reborn. Which is why I think, you know, that's why I said earlier that I think they pigeonholed themselves a bit. So the whole balance versus stuff being broken but potentially more fun / unique is, again, a tricky line to walk, especially since people now in games care so much about balance, and especially in 14 being 100% optimal 100% of the time, as opposed to maybe just doing what they find fun, even if it isn't the best. You know, look at, I guess you could look at Warrior, or you could look at Ninja. No one's playing Ninja right now, and part of that is because the job is just not designed well anymore, because there's so much clipping. But another reason why a lot of people don't want to play Ninja is because it doesn't do enough DPS, whatever the heck that means. Who cares, dude? All the jobs can clear the content, which I think is a good thing, and if they employ some of the things that I'm talking about, that might change, which I do think would be a problem. I do think all the jobs should be able to clear the content, because, like, let's be real, they should be able to. You know, Ninja, I've heard people say, I don't want to play Ninja because it doesn't do as much damage as the other jobs. And it's like, dude, why do you care so much? If you really enjoy playing Ninja, play Ninja. It can clear the content just fine. Just because you're not doing 17k DPS like the monk, who cares? You get to throw shuriken. You know what I mean? Like, I think sometimes people get a little too concerned about how much damage their job is doing, and they forget about the fact that how is it to play? You know, I stopped playing Ninja because I didn't enjoy playing it, because I had to clip every single thing to do anything now, and it just wasn't fun, and it was just awful. Like, it was just terrible. I didn't stop playing it because I wasn't parsing higher than everyone else. Like, I could care less, you know what I mean? So I kind of rambled a lot. I think this is like probably going to be like a half-hour-ish video. But thanks for checking it out. That's kind of all I really had planned for this. I hope you guys enjoyed this more discussion / analytical based video of the game as a whole, and more specifically tanking. But, you know, as the game as a whole, you know, kind of started small and got bigger. These are some of the things that I've noticed over the years with expansion to expansion, the things that they've been doing. And I'm just curious, like, you know, do you guys agree? Do you guys disagree? What do you guys think? Like, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to sort of have a discussion about, you know, do you think the tanks being very similar defensively is a good thing because everyone can pick them up very easily, which that's a fair argument. That's totally fine. Or do you agree with me and you think that the tanks should be more unique and the way they mitigate should be different? You know, let's talk about it. If you enjoyed this, feel free to drop me a like and subscribe, and also you can check me out streaming live over at twitch.tv/feeper7. Thank you all. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.